My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 64 years old, and on the morning of September 11th, 2025, I died on my kitchen floor with the news still playing in the other room. I live in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where the seasons are the main event and people still wave when they drive past you. I was a nurse for 40 years at the county hospital before I retired, a lifetime spent witnessing the fragile dance between pain and healing. Now my days are filled with simple, quiet things. I have a little garden out back where the tomatoes grow wild and unruly, no matter how hard I try to tame them. My daughter Jessica lives just 10 minutes away, and her two children, Sam and Lily, are the absolute, undisputed light of my life. I am by nature a creature of habit. I find comfort in the gentle rhythm of a predictable day, a cup of coffee as the sun rises, watching the cardinals at the bird feeder, doing the crossword puzzle in my worn-out armchair. I never wanted a big, loud life. I was always perfectly happy in my small, quiet corner of the world. But I've always been a worrier. It's a side effect of being a nurse, I suppose. You see so much pain, so much fragility, that you can't help but carry a piece of it with you. And when you become a grandmother, that worry multiplies. You start to worry about the world you're leaving for your grandchildren, about the cracks you see forming in the very foundation of things. The night before I died, I couldn't sleep. The news had been on all day, a constant, droning hum of anger and grief from the television in the living room. The assassination of that young political man, Charlie Kirk. It had happened the day before, and the aftershocks were shaking the whole country. It wasn't his politics that broke my heart, not really. It was the hate. I saw it pouring out of the screen, a thick, black poison. The reporters, the commentators, the people they interviewed on the street, everyone was so angry, so utterly convinced of their own righteousness and the pure evil of the other side. I sat there in my old recliner, my hands gripping the worn-out arms, and I just wept. I cried for his young family. I cried for the soul of the person who could be filled with enough hate to pull that trigger, and I cried for our country. It felt like we were a body consuming itself, tearing at our own flesh piece by piece. I felt it in my soul, a deep, unsettling tremor, the kind of vibration you feel just before a great and terrible earthquake. It was a premonition, a dread so heavy it felt like a physical weight, that this terrible event wasn't an end. It was a beginning. I finally turned off the television around 2:00 in the morning, but the angry voices followed me into the silence of the house. The arguments replayed in my head, pundits shouting over each other, their faces contorted in masks of self-righteous fury. I saw comments scrolling on the screen, anonymous people typing out sentences full of a venom so potent it felt like it could poison the water supply. They weren't just disagreeing. They were dehumanizing. They spoke of their political opponents not as fellow Americans with different ideas, but as an infection, a cancer that needed to be cut out for the nation to survive. And I heard this language coming from both sides, a terrible mirrored reflection of the same spiritual sickness. Each side was utterly convinced of its own moral purity and the demonic nature of its opposition. I couldn't sleep. I sat in my old recliner, the one with the permanent imprint of my body in the cushions, and I prayed. It was less of a prayer and more of a quiet, desperate argument with God. What is happening to us? I whispered into the quiet of my living room, the only light coming from the street lamp outside. I don't recognize this country anymore. I remember a time when people could disagree without hating each other, when a neighbor was a neighbor, not a political enemy. My thoughts turned to my grandchildren, to Sam and Lily. What kind of world were we making for them? A world where every disagreement becomes a reason for division, where every difference of opinion is seen as a declaration of war. My heart ached with a grandmother's grief, a sorrow that was both personal and national. I felt the tremor in my soul again, that feeling of a great and terrible cracking in the foundations of the world. The assassination, as tragic as it was just a symptom. The disease was the hatred, and it was spreading, metastasizing in the heart of the nation. I prayed for hours, tears streaming down my tired face. It wasn't a prayer for one side to win or for the other side to be punished. It was a desperate plea for healing. Father, I cried, please have mercy on us. Don't let us tear ourselves apart. Remind us how to love each other. Remind us how to be a family again before it's too late. I finally fell asleep in that chair, my prayer unfinished, my heart still heavy with the weight of a nation's grief and a terrible, unspoken premonition of what this escalating hatred would ultimately unleash. The next morning, I woke up stiff and sore in the recliner. The house was quiet, the way an old house is in the pre-dawn hours, full of the gentle sounds of a refrigerator humming and floorboards settling. But the quiet in the house did not match the storm in my soul. That feeling of heavy, sorrowful dread from the night before was still there, sitting on my chest like a physical weight. I pushed myself out of the chair and walked into the kitchen to begin the one ritual that felt normal, the one thing I could control, making coffee. I remember the familiar, comforting smell of the old coffee grounds in the metal can. I reached up into the cupboard for a mug, my hand automatically going for my favorite one, a lopsided, lumpy thing my grandson Sam had painted for me in the first grade. It was covered in wild, joyful streaks of blue and green, the colors of the sky and the grass, the colors of life. I set it on the counter, ready to pour in the hot water, and then it happened. It wasn't like in the movies. There was no dramatic clutching of the chest, no big theatrical fall. It was a sharp, biting pain that ignited in the very center of my being, a white-hot poker that drove straight through me. It took my breath away. All of it, in an instant, my lungs felt like they had turned to stone. I tried to cry out to call for help, but I couldn't make a sound. My right hand instinctively went to my chest, and the mug, my grandson's precious work of art, slipped from my other hand. It hit the linoleum floor with a sharp, shattering crack, the only sound in the quiet kitchen. I remember seeing the blue and green pieces scattering across the floor like broken bits of sky. And then I was falling. The world tilted sideways, the familiar lines of my kitchen cabinets and countertops turning into a dizzying, diagonal blur. The last thing I saw was the round, frosted glass of the ceiling light, looking like a fuzzy, distant star in a rapidly darkening sky. The last thing I heard was the frantic, panicked drumming of my own heart beating one last time. And then silence, but it wasn't the end. It was a transition. Suddenly, I wasn't on the floor anymore. I was floating, gently and peacefully, near the ceiling. I looked down and I saw myself. My body, clad in my old, worn-out housecoat, was lying still on the floor, surrounded by the broken pieces of the mug. There was no pain, there was no fear. There was only a strange, serene detachment, like I was watching a scene from a quiet, sad movie. I saw my gray hair fanned out on the floor. I saw the deep worry lines etched on my own face, and I felt a wave of compassion for the tired old woman down there. And my first thought, I swear to you, my very first thought as a newly disembodied soul was, oh, Jessica is going to be so upset about this mess. A mother's thought, I guess, it lasts an eternity. From the living room, I could still hear the faint, muffled sound of the television I'd forgotten to turn off. The voices were distant, like they were coming from underwater. But I could still make out the tone. They were still talking about the assassination. They were still arguing, they were still blaming. That river of anger was still flowing through my home, even as I was here, wherever here was. Then I felt a pull. It wasn't rough, it was gentle, like a current in a slow-moving river, inviting me to leave the noise behind. The kitchen, the sound of the TV, the sight of my own body, it all started to get smaller and smaller, and I turned my awareness toward the silent, loving current that was drawing me home. I was moving into a tunnel. It wasn't a dark, frightening passage, but one made of soft, swirling light like the inside of a cloud at sunrise. The angry, muffled voices of the television, the last lingering connection to the world I had left, disappeared completely. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was only silence. It was not an empty silence, but a deep, perfect, and holy silence, a silence that was a substance in itself, a healing balm that washed over my soul. And in that beautiful quiet, all the worry I had carried for 64 years simply lifted off of me. The constant, low-grade anxiety of being a nurse, responsible for the lives of others. The deep, foundational worry of being a mother, a worry that never truly sleeps. And the heavy, soul-wearying worry of being a grandmother in a world that seemed to be growing darker and colder by the day. It all just lifted, like a heavy, soaked winter coat that I had been wearing for so long I had forgotten its weight, and I was finally being allowed to take it off. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. At the end of this beautiful, silent journey, the light opened up into an endless expanse. It wasn't a place you could describe with earthly words like room or sky. It was simply a state of being, a realm of pure existence, and he was there. I knew instantly it was Jesus. Now I need to be very clear about this because it's important. He did not look like any of the gentle, stained glass paintings I'd seen in church my whole life. There was no golden halo, no flowing white robe. It is hard even now to say what he looked like. His form was made of a light that didn't blind you or hurt your eyes. It was a light that felt like truth, a light that felt like home. But the first and most overwhelming thing I felt from him wasn't the ecstatic joy I might have expected. It wasn't a booming, celestial welcome, it was sorrow. A deep, profound, and heavy sorrow radiated from him like warmth from a fire. It was a sadness so pure, so ancient, and so vast that it made the grief I had felt in my recliner the night before seem like a shallow, insignificant puddle. This was an ocean of grief. It was the unmistakable grief of a loving father watching his beloved children willfully, furiously hurt each other. And I felt it in every part of my soul. The air around him, the very atmosphere of heaven, was still and heavy with this sacred sadness. It felt as if the entire universe had paused to hold its breath in reverence for his heartbreak. He didn't speak with a voice you could hear. His thoughts simply arrived inside of me, clearer than any spoken word, gentler than any whisper. And the first thing he communicated was my name, followed by a simple, heartbreaking invitation. Margaret, you see, he was inviting me to see what he saw, to feel what he felt. I didn't know what to say, I just stood in his presence, my own peace mingling with his profound sorrow. Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't for my own death or for the family I had left behind. They were tears of pure, unadulterated understanding. I was crying because, for the first time, I was sharing his heartbreak for the world, and then he showed me why. The light around us shifted, and the infinite, formless expanse of heaven coalesced into a new perspective. It was as if we were standing on a great, celestial balcony, looking down upon the world of humanity. But I wasn't seeing cities or nations, maps or borders. Jesus was showing me something deeper, more fundamental. I was seeing hearts. Before he showed me the sickness, however, he first shared with me the nature of his sorrow, allowing me to feel a fraction of what he was feeling. It was the most profound and holy emotion I have ever experienced. On earth, our grief is so often tainted with despair, with anger, with self-pity. His was not like that. It was a pure, clean, and powerful sorrow, a grief that was completely and inextricably interwoven with a fierce, unbreakable, and unconditional love. It was the grief of a master artist, watching his most beloved masterpiece being defaced. It was the sorrow of a composer, listening to his most beautiful symphony being played horribly out of tune. But most of all, it was the specific, piercing grief of a perfect father, watching his beloved children, children for whom he had sacrificed everything, arming themselves against one another in a fit of prideful rage. He didn't have to speak the words, the understanding flowed from his heart to mine. They have forgotten they are brothers and sisters, the thought was a wave of pure sadness. They have forgotten they were all created in my image, by the same loving hand. They look at one another and see an enemy, a label, a political party, a threat. I look at them and see my children, and my heart breaks as they draw their battle lines against their own kin. I finally understood the depth of the tremor I had felt in my soul the night before. I was feeling a faint echo of this, his divine heartbreak. I understood that the coming conflict he was about to show me was not, in its essence, political or ideological. It was a family tragedy. The most painful of all wars is a civil war, a war of brother against brother, and the conflict that was brewing in America was, in his eyes, precisely that. His sorrow was not just for the angry words and the division of the present, but for the terrible, bloody harvest that he knew such seeds of hatred would inevitably produce. He was weeping for the war that had not yet been declared, but was already being fought in the secret, bitter chambers of his children's hearts. Having allowed me to understand the source and nature of his grief, he then began to show me the evidence, the proof of the sickness that was causing him such pain. His thought gently directed my gaze to the first scene in this heartbreaking panorama of a nation at war with itself. From our vantage point on the celestial balcony, Jesus directed my gaze. The vast spiritual landscape of the nation zoomed in with an intimate and uncomfortable focus, and we were now looking into a single home. It was a nice house, the kind you see in commercials, with a well-tended lawn and a warm light glowing from the windows. Inside, a family was gathered around the dinner table. It was a scene that should have been a portrait of peace. A mother, a father, a college-aged son home for the weekend, and a teenage daughter. The food was steaming on their plates. But I could feel, with the perfect perception I had been given, that there was no peace in that room. The air was thick with a tense, unspoken animosity, a cold war being fought in the silence between bites of food. The father made a comment, a casual, dismissive remark about a politician he disliked. It was the spark that lit the fuse. The son immediately shot back with a sarcastic retort, his voice dripping with the condescending certainty of a young man with a new education. In an instant, the strained peace shattered, and the dinner table became a battlefield. As they began to argue, Jesus allowed me to see the spiritual reality of their words. When the father, his face reddening with anger, spoke to his son, his words were not just vibrations in the air. I saw them manifest as sharp, ugly projectiles, like spiritual bullets or shards of broken glass. They flew across the table and struck the son's soul, and I could see them leave small, dark wounds of rejection and resentment. They weren't discussing ideas anymore. They were attacking each other's very identity. The son, feeling wounded, retaliated in kind. His words of disrespect and contempt for his father's beliefs became his own volley of spiritual ammunition, striking his father's heart, deepening the wounds of a generational divide. I watched in horror as these two people, a father and son who should have been bound by love, engaged in a brutal skirmish, each utterly convinced of his own righteousness. The mother I saw had become a casualty of this domestic war. She just stared down at her plate, her face a mask of quiet heartbreak, her spirit wilting under the crossfire. The teenage daughter had retreated entirely, her face buried in the cold, blue light of her phone, a refugee seeking asylum in a digital world, learning the terrible lesson that home was not a safe harbor but a place of conflict. The ugly scene reached its crescendo and then it froze. In the sudden, profound silence, Jesus' sorrowful thought entered my mind again, a diagnosis so chilling it made me tremble. The enemy doesn't need to break down the door when he is invited to the dinner table as an honored guest. I understood. The great national conflict I had been dreading was not being forged in the halls of government or on the battlefields of a distant land. The hatred required to fuel a civil war was being incubated here. It was being nurtured and fed in the kitchens and living rooms of millions of homes, where love was being starved and anger was being served as the main course. This was the first battle line. This was where the war began. The heartbreaking vision of the family dinner table faded, but the feeling of sorrow it had produced lingered in my soul. I had just witnessed the first front in this quiet, undeclared war. The home was meant to be a sanctuary, the thought of Jesus communicated, confirming my understanding, a place of safety where love could be nurtured. But the enemy has turned it into a training ground for his armies. Now, let me show you what is happening in the sanctuaries themselves. The perspective shifted again, and I was looking down upon a church. It was a beautiful old building, a classic white chapel with a tall steeple, the kind that looks like it belongs on a postcard. It was Sunday morning and the pews were full, but just as in the home, I could feel that there was no peace here. I was shown the hearts of the people. These were men and women who had worshipped together for decades. I saw flashes of their shared history. They had baptized each other's children, they had brought casseroles to each other's homes in times of grief, they had buried each other's parents. They were a family, but now they were standing on opposite sides of the center aisle and they were glaring. I saw two elderly women who had run the church bake sale together for 20 years, now refusing to make eye contact because one had a political sign in her yard that the other despised. I witnessed a deacon cornering the young pastor after the service, his face flushed with anger, accusing him of not being patriotic enough in his sermon. The prayers of the congregation, which should have been a unified chorus of worship, had become weapons. I could perceive their silent prayers, and they were not for unity or for wisdom. They were prayers of self-righteousness, asking God to correct, to humble, and even to punish the people on the other side of the aisle. They were using prayer as a means to ask God to take their side in a political argument. And as this discord filled God's house, I saw a terrible thing happen in the spiritual realm. A thin, shimmering crack of darkness appeared in the very foundation of the church, running right down the main aisle. With every angry glare, with every prideful prayer, with every cold shoulder turned to a brother or sister, the crack widened and deepened. It became a chasm, and from it, a palpable spiritual cold began to rise, a deadening energy that was quenching the warmth of the Holy Spirit in the room. The songs of worship began to sound hollow. The beautiful stained glass windows seemed to lose their color. Then Jesus' voice entered my mind again, and it was filled with a sorrow so profound it felt like the cry of a betrayed husband. They use my name, but they do not carry my heart. The vision intensified, and I understood the core of the problem, the act of spiritual adultery they were committing. They have chosen a flag over my cross. They have wrapped their political ideologies in the language of my scripture, and they have bowed down to worship a golden calf of their own making. They are more passionate about defending their party than they are about defending the orphan and the widow. They are more eager to win a political argument than they are to win a soul for my kingdom. And this idolatry has given the enemy a legal foothold to shatter the very foundations of my house. The vision of the fractured, freezing sanctuary faded, leaving me with the devastating image of that dark chasm, a symbol of a civil war that had already begun in the heart of the American church. The vision of the fractured sanctuary, with its cold, dark chasm, dissolved, but the feeling of sacred sorrow remained. Jesus then pulled my perspective back, showing me how the spiritual sickness that infects a family and divides a church inevitably spills out into the wider world. The poison that starts in the heart, his thought communicated, and is nurtured in the home and the sanctuary, now flows into the streets. I was now looking down on a city. It was an anonymous American city. It could have been anywhere. I saw people walking down the sidewalks, moving in and out of coffee shops, driving in their cars. But the spiritual atmosphere was thick with a choking fog of suspicion. I witnessed 1,000 tiny, cold interactions. A woman in a grocery store seeing a political bumper sticker on the car next to hers and her face hardening into a mask of contempt. Two men in an elevator, noticing the logos on each other's shirts, standing in a tense, stony silence. Neighbor looking at neighbor, not with kindness, but with a silent, fearful assessment. What side are you on? Who did you vote for? Are you one of us or one of them? The questions were silent, but they were screaming in the air, creating invisible walls between people who, just a few years before, would have shared a friendly, meaningless greeting. And then I saw the source of the infection. I saw them. They were everywhere. In the shadows of the tall buildings, hovering behind people in the coffee shops, clinging to the pews in the churches, and sitting, unseen, at the dinner tables of the nation. They were not monsters with horns and pitchforks. That would have been too obvious. They were like smudges of darkness, like heat rising off a summer road, but cold. They were parasitic spirits of division, and they were feeding. They clung to the angry, whispering justifications into their ears, making their rage feel righteous, their suspicion feel like wisdom. They feasted on the division. They grew fat and strong on the hatred that poured from human hearts. I watched horrified as one of these smudges whispered into the ear of a man scrolling his phone. I saw the man's face twist in rage at something he read. His thumbs began to fly across the screen as he typed a comment full of venom and cruelty, a digital drop of poison. And as he hit send, I saw the dark smudge beside him seem to inhale, drawing in the dark energy of the man's hatred, growing slightly larger, slightly more defined. It was a terrifying, symbiotic relationship. The spirits provided the fuel for the rage, and the humans provided the rage as food for the spirits. I began to weep, a deep, shuddering sob of pure terror. What is this, Lord? My spirit cried out. What is happening? His presence wrapped around me then, not to shield me from the sight, but to give me the strength to bear it. His sorrow was still there, a constant, heartbreaking bass note, but it was now mixed with the powerful love of a king who refuses to abandon his people to the enemy. This is the true war, he communicated, his words burning away all my previous, naive understandings of the world's problems. The soul of your nation is sick. Now, Eleanor, I must show you where this sickness lies if it is left untreated. I must show you the fever that is about to break upon the land. His thought was a command, and the vision of the spiritually infested city shifted, pulling back to a wider, national perspective. He was showing me the soul of America, but it was not a landscape of mountains and plains. It was a landscape dominated by a single, horrifying feature. The assassination that broke your heart, Eleanor, his voice was a sorrowful whisper that burned into my soul, was not the cause of the sickness. It was a symptom, a fever breaking on the skin of a body already poisoned. The true danger is not the bullet from a single gun, but the hatred it awakens in millions of hearts. And then he showed me the source of the fever. America is standing at a river of blood, he declared, and the vision solidified before me. I saw a vast, dark river carving its way through the heart of the nation. It was not a river of water, but a thick, slow-moving, deep red river of spiritual energy. It was a river of collective animosity, of unforgiveness, of righteous anger, of partisan hatred, and I saw how it was being fed. From the dinner table I had just witnessed, a tiny, dark trickle of poison flowed from the wounded hearts of the family and joined the river. From the fractured church with the chasm down its center, a larger, colder stream of sanctimonious anger flowed, feeding the main current. From the suspicious, fearful city, a million tiny, polluted streams of contempt and judgment flowed, all joining together, making the great, dark river wider, deeper, and more powerful with every passing moment. Every hateful comment online, every family argument, every church split was another drop of poison. We were all feeding it every day. Now watch, Jesus said, his sorrow deepening. Watch what happens when the river is allowed to overflow its banks. The vision accelerated, and I watched in absolute, abject horror as the river of blood swelled, its currents growing faster and more violent. It rose higher and higher until it breached its spiritual banks and began to flood the physical land. The flood was not one of water, but of chaos. I was shown quick, terrible flashes of a future that felt just a breath away. I saw a suburban street, the kind with green lawns and children's bicycles, now a scene of horror. A house was burning, and a man stood in his yard with a rifle, screaming at the neighbor he had known for 20 years. I saw a city square, filled not with peaceful protesters, but with brawling, warring factions, their faces twisted with a rage that had gone far beyond politics into a pure, violent tribalism. I saw a beautiful old church, its windows smashed, its doors boarded up, a dead and empty monument to a faith that had failed to bring peace because it had forgotten how to love. This was not a war of armies in uniform. It was the far more terrible war of citizen against citizen, neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. This was the fever dream that my nation was rushing to embrace, a future born from a million small choices to prefer being right over being merciful. The vision was so terrible, so real, that my soul screamed in silent protest. I was no longer just a sad observer. I was a terrified grandmother, seeing a vision of the world my own grandchildren, Sam and Lily, might inherit. I turned my awareness to Jesus, my entire being a single, desperate question: is there any hope? Is it too late? The horrifying vision of a nation at war with itself faded, but the terror it imprinted upon my soul remained. In the face of such a catastrophic future, my spirit cried out with a single, silent question that was more of a prayer than a thought: is there any hope? The sorrowful presence of Jesus, which had been a constant, gentle pressure, now wrapped around me like a warm, heavy blanket. The sorrow was still there, but it was now mingled with the powerful, reassuring love of a great physician who, despite the grim diagnosis, has not given up on the patient. This is the path your nation is on, his voice communicated, a statement of fact, not of finality. But the future is not yet written in stone. It is a destination that can be avoided, but first, my children must understand the true nature of their sickness. He then gave me the full, heartbreaking diagnosis. The soul of your nation is sick, Eleanor, he began, and the assassination that broke your heart was not the cause. It was merely a symptom. It was a violent fever breaking on the skin of a body that was already deeply poisoned from within. I asked what the poison was. It is the deadliest of all poisons, he answered, because it is the one my children drink willingly, believing it to be medicine. It is the poison of righteous anger. It is the unforgiveness that feels justified. It is the hatred that cloaks itself in the language of principle and truth. I saw what he meant. I saw the faces of the people on the news, their mouths twisted in rage, utterly convinced of their own moral superiority. They believed their anger was a sign of their goodness, when in reality it was a symptom of their sickness. My children are perishing, he said, and the wave of his sadness washed over me again. They are so busy, so passionate, fighting for their earthly kingdoms that they have forgotten my heavenly one. They pour all their energy into defending a political party, a flag, an ideology. They scream for victory for their side when they should be on their knees, begging for mercy for their own souls and the souls of their brothers and sisters. They demand justice for the wrongs done to them, when they should be offering the radical, undeserved forgiveness that I first offered them. I saw the tragic, cosmic irony of it all. They were fighting to save their country, but in the process, they were poisoning their own hearts and tearing apart the very fabric of their families and churches. They were winning political battles while losing the true war for their own souls. I stood there just taking it all in, my own heart breaking. I had spent my entire life as a nurse, learning to diagnose and treat the illnesses of the human body. And here was Jesus, the great physician, showing me the sickness in our collective soul, a cancer of the spirit that was metastasizing across the land. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming, the diagnosis so complete and so terrible. A feeling of profound hopelessness threatened to crush me. What can we do? I asked, my own spirit crying out, the plea of a single, tired old woman. It's too much, it's too big. How can we possibly heal a sickness this deep? My soul's desperate cry, it's too much. It's too big, hung in the holy silence, a testament to my human frailty in the face of such a vast and overwhelming spiritual sickness. I expected a grand, complex strategy, a 7-point plan for national revival. But Jesus' answer was so simple, so gentle, and so profoundly personal it undid me all over again. It starts small, Eleanor, his thought answered, not with a booming command, but with a quiet, loving whisper that calmed the storm of my hopelessness. It starts in here. And I felt his presence gently touch my spiritual heart, the very core of my being. He was showing me that the healing of a nation does not begin in its halls of power, but in the quiet, unseen chambers of its individual human hearts. And then he showed me the antidote in action. He showed me the power of a single drop of clean, living water. The vision returned to the dinner table, the one that had become a battlefield. The air was still thick with tension. I saw the father open his mouth, his face beginning to redden, another spiritual bullet of angry rhetoric already chambered. But then something shifted. He paused, he looked at his son, truly looked at him, and I saw a flicker of divine grace, a golden thread of mercy touch his heart. He closed his mouth, took a slow breath, and the angry words dissolved before they were ever spoken. Son, he said, his voice quiet and heavy, I'm sorry, I don't want to fight anymore. This is more important than that. The son, who had been braced for another volley, was visibly disarmed, his own anger deflated, replaced by a look of surprised relief. In that single difficult moment of a father choosing humility over being right, I saw the dark, ugly thread of hatred between them snap. The mother looked up from her plate, and a tear of pure, grateful relief traced a path down her cheek. It was one drop of clean water. The scene shifted to the fractured church. I saw an old deacon, a man I had seen glaring with righteous anger, walking slowly but deliberately across the center aisle. He approached a man on the other side, a man he had been arguing with viciously on social media all week. He extended his hand. Brother, the deacon said, his voice thick with an emotion that had cost him his pride. We may not agree about what is best for this country, but I know you are my brother in Christ. I have sinned against you with my anger and my contempt. Will you please forgive me? I watched as the two men embraced, and in the spiritual realm, I saw the dark, cold chasm that had split the sanctuary shutter. A sliver of brilliant, warm light began to stitch the crack together from below. It was one drop of clean water. Finally, he showed me a woman alone in her car, listening to an angry talk radio show. The host was stoking her fear and her rage, and I could see a smudge of darkness clinging to her, feeding on her emotions. Then the car next to her, with a bumper sticker she despised, cut her off in traffic. A curse formed on her lips, but she stopped. Remembering a promise she had made to God, she instead whispered a small, secret prayer. Lord, she said, I don't understand that person, but you love them, so please bless them, keep them safe on the road. It was a tiny act, unseen by anyone, but in the spiritual realm, it was a thunderclap. I saw the smudge of darkness recoil as if it had been burned, starved of the anger it was expecting to feast on. It was one drop of clean water. It starts with one person choosing mercy over being right, Jesus' voice affirmed as the visions faded. It starts with one prayer for an enemy, a real prayer from the heart. It starts with one family turning off the noise and looking into each other's eyes again. Every act of quiet love, every moment of hidden forgiveness, is a drop of clean living water in that poisoned river. It may seem small, but it is the only thing that can heal the land. The visions of those small, powerful acts of healing filled me with a sense of hope that I hadn't felt since this journey began. As a nurse, I understood the principle. You don't heal a septic patient by treating the fever, you treat the underlying infection. Jesus had shown me that the fever was the political assassinations and the riots, but the infection was the hatred in our hearts. And these small acts of mercy, forgiveness, and love were the only true antibiotic. I felt a profound sense of peace in this understanding. The problem was vast, but the solution was something anyone, anywhere could participate in. But just as I was settling into this gentle medical metaphor, Jesus elevated my understanding one final, awesome time. What you see as medicine, Eleanor, his thought was both loving and powerful, is also a weapon. It is the only weapon that has any power in the true war. The vision shifted one last time. I was shown the man from before, sitting in the dark, his face illuminated by his phone, his heart filled with rage. The parasitic smudge of darkness was clinging to him, whispering in his ear, ready to feast on the hate he was about to unleash in a vicious online comment. But this time I witnessed a different choice. The man typed out his angry, venomous screed. His thumb hovered over the send button. The dark spirit lined in closer, expectant. Then the man stopped. He sighed a long, weary breath, and I could feel a silent, internal battle raging within him. He deleted the entire angry paragraph. Instead, he found a comment from someone on the other side who was being viciously attacked, and he typed a simple, unexpected sentence. I don't agree with your point of view, but I am sorry people are being so cruel to you. I hope you have a better day. It was a tiny act, insignificant in the world's great, noisy battle of ideologies. But in the spiritual realm, it was a nuclear bomb. The moment he chose mercy over rage, the moment he offered a drop of unexpected kindness to an enemy, his small act of love manifested as a brilliant, searing flash of pure light. The smudge of darkness that had been clinging to him didn't just retreat, it was violently thrown back, hissing and writhing as if it had been burned. It was starved, weakened, and defeated by a weapon it could not comprehend. I finally understood. Love isn't passive, forgiveness isn't weak, mercy isn't surrender. They are active, offensive, and devastatingly effective weapons against the forces of division and hatred. The darkness feeds on our anger, but it is poisoned by our love. The vision faded, and I was left alone with Jesus, the truth of it all settling into me with a beautiful, world-altering finality. He paused, and his next words were a mission, the final summary of everything he had shown me. Go back and tell them to love, he commanded. That is all, just love. It is the only weapon that will win this war. The profound peace of his presence, the truth of his words, the all-consuming nature of his sorrowful, powerful love filled me completely. All the chaos of the world was gone, all the fear, all the anger. Here there was only this perfect reality. I never wanted to leave. I felt like a tired traveler who had finally come home. The truth of his final command, that love was the only weapon, settled into my soul, a perfect and complete answer. And with that answer came a profound sense of peace. All the chaos of the world was gone, all the fear, all the anger. Here there was only this perfect, sorrowful, powerful love. I never wanted to leave. I felt like a tired traveler who had finally come home after a long and brutal journey. And the thought of being sent back, of leaving this place of perfect peace to return to the world I had just seen, a world on the brink of tearing itself apart, was more than I could bear. Please, I begged him, the plea of my soul, a raw and desperate cry. Please let me stay here with you. I'm so tired, the world is too broken, I don't want to go back. I felt like a small child, clinging to her father's leg, weeping at the thought of being sent away from the only place she had ever felt truly safe. He looked at me then, and for the first time since my arrival, I felt the immense, heavy sorrow in his presence recede. In its place, a gentle, loving smile took its place. It was not a smile of amusement, but of deep, paternal tenderness, a smile that held all the stars in the universe, a smile that communicated more love and acceptance than 1,000 lifetimes on earth could ever contain. My dear child, the thought was filled with so much affection it made my soul ache with a sweet and holy pain. Your work is not done. Your death was not an accident. I have not shown you these terrible and beautiful things for your comfort alone. I have brought you here to see this so that you can go back and be a witness. I felt a question form in my heart, but why me? I'm just an old woman from Ohio. No one important, no one with a loud voice. His smile remained, and his answer filled me with a profound understanding of my own life. I did not need another political warrior, Eleanor. I did not need another fiery prophet to shout condemnation. The world has enough of those, and they are only adding fuel to the fire. I chose you precisely because you are a grandmother. I chose you because your heart breaks not for a political party, but for a divided family. I need this message to be delivered not with the clenched fist of a debater, but with the open, loving hands of a mother who is simply calling her children home. Your gentleness is the perfect vessel for this heavy message. I understood then. My quiet life, my simple love for my family, the compassion I learned as a nurse, none of it was an accident. It was all preparation. His gaze became serious once more, the final commission delivered with a loving but absolute authority. You must tell them what you saw. You must tell them that I am weeping for what they are doing to each other. Tell them the war they are fighting is not against flesh and blood, not against their neighbor or their countrymen, but against the darkness that feeds on their division. I cried a final, heartbreaking sob at the thought of leaving him, of leaving this place. But I knew I had to go. I had been given my orders. I am with you was the last thing he said to me, a promise that would have to be enough. Always. His final promise, I am with you always, was a comforting balm on my aching soul, a final taste of living water before being sent back into the desert. Because the moment I accepted my mission, the moment I surrendered to his will to go back, the gentle, loving current that had held me in its embrace was gone. It was replaced by a violent, downward pull, a cosmic gravity that seized my spirit and began to drag me back to the world of weight and time. The beautiful, holy silence of heaven was broken by a deafening, rushing sound like a roaring wind. I felt myself falling faster and faster, away from the light, away from him, back into the darkness, back toward the noise. It was a brutal expulsion from paradise, a painful and terrifying descent. The first thing I felt was pain. A crushing, burning, and absolute pain exploded in my chest, as if a great, heavy elephant was sitting directly on me. The weightless piece of my spiritual form was gone, violently replaced by the agony of a failing human body. The first thing I heard was a scream. It was not a scream of terror, but one of pure, disbelieving shock. It was my daughter, Jessica. She's breathing. Oh my God, Mom, you're breathing, I gasped. A huge, ragged intake of air tore through my lungs, a breath that felt like swallowing fire and broken glass. My eyes flew open and I was blinded. Not by the gentle, living light of heaven, but by the harsh, sterile, fluorescent light of a hospital room. There were faces all around me, strangers in blue scrubs, their expressions a mixture of clinical focus and utter disbelief. A machine next to my head was beeping frantically, a shrill, panicked rhythm that was the polar opposite of the celestial song I had just been hearing. I was a body again, a broken one, a specimen being frantically worked on by a team of strangers. I tried to speak, to call out his name, but only a choked, rattling croak came from my throat. Jessica was there, her hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt. Her face, which I could now barely make out, was soaked with tears, her eyes wide with a hope she had clearly lost just moments before. Mom, can you hear me? Oh, Mom, we lost you. They said you were gone. It was all so confusing. The perfect peace was gone. The sorrowful, all-encompassing love of Jesus was gone. All that was left was the pain, the noise, the smell of antiseptic, and the desperate, loving face of my daughter. I just closed my eyes and wept. I wasn't crying because I was alive. I was crying because I had just left home. I had just left him. Later, after I had been moved to a quiet room, the doctor came to see me. He was a young man with kind, intelligent eyes, but they were filled with a look of complete and utter bewilderment. He sat on the edge of my bed, holding my chart, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at me as if I were a puzzle he couldn't solve. Mrs. Vance, he said, shaking his head slowly, your daughter found you in full cardiac arrest. The paramedics worked on you for over 20 minutes on the way here. At the hospital, we continued chest compressions and defibrillation for another 10. You were clinically dead for, well, for a very long time. By all medical accounts, you shouldn't be here. And even if you were, he paused, looking me straight in the eye, you shouldn't be you. There should be significant, irreversible brain damage, but there's not. Your scans are perfect. We can't explain it. He was looking for an answer, a data point to fit into his scientific framework. I just looked at him, my heart full of a truth he couldn't find in a textbook, and I whispered, I can. I'm not a politician, I'm not a preacher, I'm not a theologian with a fancy degree. I'm just a grandmother from Ohio who died on her kitchen floor. But I was sent back with a message, and I promised him, with every fiber of my being, that I would deliver it. He asked me to tell you that heaven is real, and it is watching our world not with anger, but with a broken heart. The division in our country, the anger we feel toward people we've never even met, the contempt we have for those on the other side, it is not a political problem. It is a spiritual poison, and it is feeding a darkness that wants nothing less than to destroy us all from the inside out, a darkness that is strategically, patiently, and deliberately pushing our nation to the brink of a second civil war. Jesus didn't ask me what political party I belonged to. In the light of his presence, I understood that he didn't care. All he cared about was the condition of my heart and the condition of our hearts. He wants us to stop fighting each other. He wants us to turn off the screens that feed us a steady diet of rage and look into the eyes of our family, our neighbors, and yes, even the people we disagree with the most, and see a child of God who he loves just as fiercely as he loves us. He said the only thing that can stop the river of blood is love, the kind of love that forgives when it's easier to hold a grudge. The kind of love that listens when it's more satisfying to yell. The kind of love that builds a bridge, not a wall. So I'm asking you, not as someone who knows anything special, but as someone who was given a second chance to get it right. The next time you feel that spark of anger, that satisfying surge of self-righteousness toward the other side, whoever that is for you, please, I am begging you, stop. Take a breath, and instead of typing the angry comment, instead of speaking the cutting word, say a quiet, secret prayer for them. Drop one clean drop of living water into that poisoned river, because heaven is real. Jesus is real, he hears you, and right now his heart is breaking.